Tonight, we're stepping into a story that winds through mountains, laboratories, nightclubs, and borders. A story that begins with a small green leaf in the Andes, chewed by farmers, blessed to the mountain spirits, and carried by runners across impossible heights. But that same leaf would one day be crushed into white powder, weighed on apothecary scales in Europe, praised by doctors like Sigmund Freud, mixed into bottles of wine and even Coca-Cola. And later, that powder would fuel empires of crime, from jungle labs in South America to the gilded mansions of men like Pablo Escobar. This is the entire strange history of cocaine, from sacred offering to global obsession. Welcome to Strange Stories for Sleep, where history, mystery, and lives unfold, where we listen, we learn, we slow things down. If stories like this help you drift off, a quick tap on like and subscribe helps us keep bringing more of them to your night. Sleep deeper, wake brighter. Now dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade, and join me in the long, strange journey of a leaf that changed the world. The story of cocaine begins long before the word itself existed. It begins with coca. For thousands of years, the coca plant grew in the high Andes of South America. The altitude was unforgiving, the air thin and cold, but coca made life possible. Farmers chewed the leaves to endure long hours of labor. Messengers known as chasqui ran across mountains with coca in their cheeks. Priests offered it in rituals to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and to the Apus, the mountain spirits. To outsiders, coca seemed small, but to the people of the Andes, it was a companion, a medicine, and a bridge to the divine. This relationship was ancient. Archaeologists have found traces of coca used in mummies dating back 3,000 years. Spanish chroniclers in the 1500s wrote that Andean workers would not enter the mines of Potosí without coca leaves. Even the conquistadors, who first tried to ban the practice, eventually taxed and distributed coca to keep miners working. For centuries, coca remained a local tradition, but in the mid-19th century, everything changed. In 1859, a German chemist named Albert Niemann isolated the alkaloid that gave coca its stimulating effect. He called it cocaine. This discovery transformed a sacred plant into a global commodity. By the 1880s, doctors across Europe and America praised cocaine as a wonder drug. Sigmund Freud called it magical and recommended it to friends and patients. Surgeons used it as the first effective local anesthetic. Coca wines and tonics promised energy and vitality. Even Coca-Cola's earliest recipe contained coca leaf extract. What had once been a leaf chewed on mountain trails was now a fashionable medicine in Paris, Berlin, London, and New York. But popularity brought consequences. By the early 20th century, reports of addiction and abuse mounted. Cocaine was banned from patent medicines, and Coca-Cola quietly removed coca from its formula. By the 1920s, most nations classified cocaine as a controlled substance. Yet prohibition did not end the trade, it transformed it. Cocaine became contraband, a product that moved in shadows, and as global demand grew, so did the networks supplying it. By the 1970s and 1980s, cocaine was at the center of a global storm. Jungle labs in South America processed coca leaves into white powder. Cartels in Colombia shipped tons of it to Miami, Los Angeles, and Madrid. Cocaine fueled both glamour and violence, Wall Street parties and street shootouts, celebrity scandals, and cartel wars. The money was staggering. By the 1980s, U.S. authorities estimated that the Medellin cartel earned more than $60 million per day. At the same time, farmers in Peru or Bolivia might earn just a few dollars for harvesting coca leaves. This was the paradox of cocaine. At one end, poverty. At the other, unimaginable wealth. And in between, a chain of jobs and lives stretched across continents. The story of cocaine is not only about traffickers or addicts, it is also about the people whose work, willingly or not, sustained the trade. A coca picker in the Andes, plucking leaves at dawn. A colonial tax collector in Potosi, counting bundles of leaves. A pharmacist in 19th century Germany, holding the first crystal of pure cocaine. A chemist in a jungle shack, stirring coca paste in a metal barrel. A customs officer scanning bags at an airport, searching for hidden powder. Each role was different, some sacred, some dangerous, some absurd, but all connected to the same leaf. This series follows that leaf, from coca fields to colonial mines, from European laboratories to American pharmacies, from jungle trails to cartel mansions, from the high plateaus of South America to the neon-lit clubs of the modern world. Along the way, you will hear numbers that measure the scale. In the 1980s, Peru produced 35% of the world's coca. By the 1990s, the Cali cartel controlled 80% of the cocaine trade. Today, the global cocaine market is valued at over $100 billion annually. But you will also hear stories of farmers, soldiers, chemists, smugglers, and consumers. Stories of survival, of profit, of power, and of loss. This is not a story told in haste. It is a long journey across centuries. Each fact is a step. Each scene is a lantern. Together, they illuminate how one small leaf shaped empires, science, crime, and culture. This is the story of cocaine. From sacred leaf to secret lab, from ritual to empire, from survival to obsession. Part 1 Roots in the Andes, Daily Life of Coca Farmers, 1980s Peru. Before cocaine was a powder hidden in suitcases, it was a leaf carried in the cheeks of farmers and messengers in the high Andes. This is where the story begins. It is 1983 in the Ayacucho region of Peru, a province high in the central Andes, where the mountains rise above 3,000 meters and the air feels thin even at rest. Villages here are clusters of adobe houses with thatched roofs, dirt floors, and communal courtyards. Poverty is constant, wages scarce, and money circulates only when coca leaves are sold. For centuries, the plant has been chewed, brewed into tea, and offered to mountain spirits. But in the 1980s, coca is something else entirely. The raw material of a booming cocaine trade that is transforming the Andes into a front line of a global industry. At the time, Peru produced about 35% of the world's coca leaf, and most of it came from valleys like Ayacucho, Huallaga, and Apurimac. By UN estimates, nearly 90% of Peru's coca was diverted to the black market, while only around 10% went into legal channels, such as tea or traditional medicine. For families in Ayacucho, coca was not an abstract export statistic. It was the difference between buying rice or going hungry, between sending a child to school or keeping them home to work. Dawn in the Andes. The day begins before sunrise. In a one-room adobe hut, smoke from last night's fire lingers in the rafters. A rooster's half-hearted crow cuts the silence, and thin air seeps through a crack in the wall, sharp and cold. A pouch of dried coca leaves is passed around. Chewing them with lipta, an alkaline ash made from lime or plant matter, releases alkaloids that ease hunger and altitude fatigue. This is no indulgence. At over 10,000 feet, coca is survival. Within minutes, the bitterness in the cheek dulls into a steady calm. The lungs open slightly, and the body is ready for hours of work without a full meal. In these mountains, coca fills the same role as breakfast elsewhere. By 6 in the morning, families are walking narrow dirt paths toward the terraces. Children carry reed mats for drying. Mothers sling woven bags across their shoulders. Fathers steady tools and animals. Everyone participates because the harvest is measured not in wages, but in combined effort. Work in the fields. The coca terraces look like green staircases clinging to the slopes. Bushes stand waist-high, dense with leaves. Picking is entirely manual. Thumb and forefinger pinch, wrist twists, and the leaf falls into a cloth sling bag. Precision matters. Tearing stems weakens future growth. Skilled workers can strip hundreds of grams per hour without damaging the plants. On an average day, a single picker gathers 10 to 15 kilos of fresh leaves. Once dried in the sun, This shrinks to 3 to 5 kilos of marketable coca. Families often pool their output, each member contributing, men, women, and children alike. For households where annual cash income hovers around $500, every kilo matters. Payment is low. Licensed buyers pay $1 to $2 per kilo of dried leaf for legal uses. Traffickers offer $5 to $10, sometimes in cash, other times in fuel, soap, or rice. The math is stark. A day's work sold legally might bring in the equivalent of $2 to $3. The same leaves sold illegally could bring $25 to $50 for farmers with no savings, no state support, and no alternatives. The choice is not really a choice at all. Midday, drying and sorting. By late morning, bags of leaves are emptied onto reed mats spread along the terraces. The harvest must dry evenly in the mountain sun. Too much heat scorches the leaves, too much wind scatters them. Workers turn them by hand, smoothing them into thin layers. Children flick away stems while elders set aside especially perfect leaves, unbroken, thick, dark green. These might be saved for rituals, gifts, or as medicine for illness. The rest is prepared for buyers. Drying reduces weight, but concentrates value. 5 kilos of dried coca might represent an entire day's labor for a family. Buyers prefer darker, thicker leaves because they yield more alkaloid. Everyone in the village can tell by touch which leaves will fetch a higher price. Food, rest, and conversation. Rest is taken in the shade of a tamarisk tree or beside a stone wall. Food is simple: bread, cheese, quinoa soup. A gourd of mate de coca tea passes from hand to hand. The talk is of frost that threatened the terraces last night, of a mule that refuses to cross a certain bridge, of a neighbor's new child. Coca leaves circulate too, exchanged as casually as cigarettes in another culture. Older men sometimes tell stories of the Shasky, the Inca runners who once carried messages across the empire with coca in their cheeks. The moral is the same. Coca is not luxury, it is endurance. A plant that makes survival possible in a landscape that constantly tests the body. The numbers behind the leaves. The economic scale is vast compared to what farmers see. A single hectare of coca, about 2.5 acres, can produce 1,500 to 2,000 kilos of leaf per year. Roughly 350 kilos of dried leaf are needed to produce 1 kilo of refined cocaine hydrochloride. That single kilo, worth perhaps $1,000 at the farm gate, sells for $20,000 to $30,000 on US streets. For the farmer, however, none of that fortune is visible. Their reward is a few dollars or a sack of rice. The global chain of profit begins with their calloused fingers, but leaves them behind almost immediately. Afternoon, risks and realities. By mid-afternoon, the sun tilts and shadows stretch across the terraces. Bags are weighed on iron scales that creak with age. Numbers are murmured and jotted into notebooks. Some portion goes to licensed buyers, but much of the harvest is quietly promised to intermediaries who arrive at night. These middlemen move the leaves down into the valleys, toward jungle laboratories, where they will be soaked in kerosene and pressed into coca paste. The work itself is not the only hardship. In the 1980s, coca-growing regions were torn by overlapping pressures. Guerrillas of the Shining Path demanded taxes from farmers, sometimes in cash, sometimes in crops. The army, in turn, suspected every village of aiding the insurgency. Traffickers imposed their own rules, punishing anyone who sold to rivals. Many communities found themselves paying tribute to all three forces just to survive. Alternatives were limited. Coffee and cacao required roads, credit, and buyers, things the state rarely provided in remote valleys. Coca, on the other hand, always had a market, legal or illegal. Abandoning it was a fantasy. Evening in the village. When the sun sets, the day's rhythm softens. A pot of stew simmers in a clay hearth, sending steam into the cool night air. Children chase each other across the courtyard until darkness convinces them to sleep. A charango made from a gourd appears, its high notes rising above the quiet. Coca is present here too, chewed during conversation, brewed as tea for the old, placed as offerings for mountain spirits. It is medicine, ritual, and currency at once. But its other destiny is never far away. The majority of today's harvest, dried and bundled, will leave the village under cover of night. By the time it reaches jungle labs, then the hands of traffickers, then smugglers at airports, its value will multiply 100-fold. The picker will see none of that wealth. For them, coca remains what it has always been, a plant that steadies lungs, fills stomachs modestly, and keeps a family alive another day. Conquistadors and the colonial coca leaf economy. When the Spanish conquistadors first entered the Andes in the 1530s, they encountered a world that was already ancient. The Inca Empire, stretching along the spine of South America, organized millions of people across mountains and valleys, tied together by roads, terraces, and ritual. And everywhere in that world, there was coca. Small green leaves were carried in woven pouches, chewed by farmers in the fields, offered in ceremonies to mountain spirits, or placed in the mouths of the dead. To the conquistadors, unfamiliar with the high altitude and with no cultural reference for the leaf, coca seemed strange, at once trivial and powerful. At first, the Spaniards dismissed it. In some early accounts, priests condemned coca as the devil's weed, a tool of idolatry used to worship false gods. Spanish chronicler José de Acosta wrote in 1590 that coca seems to be a worthless leaf, but those of the Andes esteem it so much that they cannot be without it. Colonial authorities briefly tried to suppress coca chewing, banning its use in churches and attempting to cut down terraces of coca bushes. But suppression proved futile. The highland populations were deeply dependent on coca. Centuries of experience had taught them its uses: to ease the shortness of breath in thin air, to dull hunger during long labor, and to sustain endurance during travel across mountain passes. To remove coca was to remove the foundation of daily survival. For indigenous farmers, refusing coca was not an option. The Spanish quickly learned this truth firsthand in the silver mines. Coca in the mines of Potosí. In 1545, silver was discovered in Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia. The mountain of Cerro Rico became the richest source of silver in the world, feeding Spain's empire and Europe's economy. But mining at nearly 4,800 meters, 15,700 feet, was brutal. Air was thin, cold seeped through stone, and shifts could stretch from dawn to dusk. To force indigenous laborers into these conditions, the Spanish imposed the meter system, a draft labor tax that required thousands of men to work in the mines each year. The colonial administrators quickly realized that coca was essential to keeping miners alive and productive. Chewing leaves allowed workers to endure 12-hour shifts with little food, suppressing hunger and easing fatigue. Spanish priests might condemn coca as pagan, but colonial accountants recognized its value. By the late 1500s, coca was not only tolerated, but actively distributed to miners by colonial authorities. Records from the period are striking. By the end of the 16th century, hundreds of thousands of baskets of coca leaves were being shipped annually into Potosí. In some accounts, miners consumed half a pound of coca per week, each man needing a steady supply to survive. The Spanish crown took notice. Taxes were levied on coca sales, ensuring a steady revenue stream. The leaf that had once been sacred offering now became colonial currency. The coca trade under Spanish rule. Coca plantations multiplied across the valleys of Peru and Bolivia. Indigenous communities were forced to grow coca as tribute, while merchants and landowners profited from selling the harvest to mining centers. By the 17th century, coca had become a cornerstone of the colonial economy. Prices fluctuated, but coca was always in demand where labor was hardest. In mining towns, coca could be worth its weight in silver. Spanish administrators documented annual profits in the millions of pesos, a staggering sum for the time. The system was clear. Indigenous farmers grew coca. Colonial merchants transported and sold it. miners consumed it, and the Spanish crown collected taxes on every step. The leaf had been transformed. Where it once marked respect for mountain gods, it was now measured in ledgers and taxed by empire. The spiritual exchange between human and landscape became an economic transaction between subject and ruler. The dual identity of Coca, yet Coca never lost its older meaning. In the villages, farmers still began the day by tucking 3 leaves into their cheeks, offering them to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and to the Apos, the mountain spirits. Rituals continued in parallel with commerce. The same leaves that sustained a miner in Potosi also marked a wedding, a burial, or a prayer for rain. This dual identity, sacred in one context, exploited in another, was not accidental. Colonialism thrives by appropriating what it cannot erase. Coca was too useful to ban, too deeply embedded in Andean life to uproot. So it was co-opted, folded into systems of labor extraction, and made profitable for the crown. Violence and dependency. The expansion of coca under Spanish rule came with violence. Indigenous communities were forced to plant coca instead of food crops, reshaping local agriculture. Farmers who resisted were punished. Tribute in coca was demanded alongside tribute in silver or labor. Entire valleys shifted toward coca production, not because families chose it freely, but because the empire required it. For the workers themselves, coca became both ally and trap. It allowed miners to endure punishing conditions, but it also tethered them to the system that exploited them. Colonial officials calculated exactly how much coca a laborer needed to keep working without collapsing, ensuring supply, but never relief. What had once been a gift of endurance became a tool of coercion. Economic scale. By the 17th century, coca was one of the most profitable sectors of the Andean colonial economy. Some estimates suggest that taxes on coca generated more income for the crown than the silver mines themselves at certain points. Merchants who controlled the coca trade amassed fortunes. For indigenous farmers, however, the benefits remained minimal. They still lived in poverty, their work diverted to supply the mines, their autonomy eroded by taxation and forced labor. Legacy of colonial coca. The colonial coca economy left deep marks that persisted long after Spanish rule. It created the first large-scale commercial networks for coca leaves, linking growers, traders, consumers, and states in a system of profit and exploitation. It normalized the idea that coca could be taxed, regulated, and turned into revenue for rulers. And it set the precedent for coca as both a substance of survival for the poor and a source of wealth for the powerful. By the time Spain's hold on South America weakened in the early 19th century, coca was inseparable from both Andean identity and Andean exploitation. The miners of Potosi had shown Europe what coca could do, not as sacred ritual, but as economic engine. That engine would roar to life again centuries later when the leaf became cocaine. Myths, runners, and coca as medicine. Long before Spanish chroniclers described it, and centuries before European chemists isolated cocaine from it, coca was already ancient. Archaeological digs in Peru and Bolivia have uncovered 3,000-year-old pouches containing dried coca leaves alongside lime or ashes used to activate their alkaloids. Mummies have been found with coca in their cheeks, a final offering for the journey into the afterlife. Pottery shards depict coca bundles being raised in prayer. For indigenous peoples of the Andes, coca was not a crop in the modern sense. It was a companion, a sacred thread woven into ritual, labor, and myth. Myth gave coca its meaning. In some Quechua traditions, the plant was born from the tears of Pachamama, the Earth Mother, shed for the suffering of her children in the thin air of the mountains. In Aymara stories, coca came from the body of a sacrificed woman, her spirit transformed so her people would endure. Different valleys told the story differently, but the message was the same. Coca was a gift from the sacred to the human. Each time a farmer tucked 3 leaves, called a quintu, into their cheek and offered them to the mountain peaks, apus, they weren't just easing hunger. They were maintaining a covenant with the world around them, the runners of the Inca. If coca gave meaning to ritual, it also powered one of the greatest logistical systems in the ancient world. The Inca Empire stretched over 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, yet it had no wheels, no horses, and no written alphabet. Its lifeline was the Chasqui, a network of elite runners who carried messages, goods, and even fresh fish from the coast to the capital in Cusco. The system was astonishingly efficient. Relay stations spaced every few miles allowed one runner to hand a message to the next. With coca in their cheeks, the Chasqui could maintain steady speed at high altitude. Chroniclers described them covering 150 to 200 miles in a single day. A quipu, knotted cords encoding numbers, might pass through dozens of mouths and pairs of lungs before reaching its destination, but it still arrived faster than most communication systems in Europe at the time. Imagine the scene. Dawn on a mountain trail, thin air biting at the chest, a runner's sandals slapping stone. The path rises, drops, and clings to cliff sides. In the cheek, a wad of coca dulls hunger, numbs fatigue, and keeps the breath steady. The bundle being carried is small, but vital. A quipu counting tribute, or an order from the Sapa Inca himself. In these moments, coca was not merely a leaf, it was an empire's fuel, medicine of the highlands. Beyond empire and ritual, coca served as daily medicine. In villages perched above 10,000 feet, life was a constant negotiation with altitude, cold, and scarcity. Coca offered relief. Chewed with lipta ash, it opened the lungs and slowed the gnaw of hunger. Brewed into mate de coca tea, it soothed stomach pains, altitude headaches, and nausea. Mixed into poultices, it was applied to wounds. Mothers passed knowledge of coca remedies to daughters, who passed them to theirs, ensuring continuity across generations. Modern science has confirmed part of what indigenous people knew intuitively. Coca leaves contain 14 distinct alkaloids, including the one later isolated as cocaine. In leaf form, however, these compounds are mild. A handful of leaves chewed across a day releases small amounts slowly, dilating airways, improving oxygen uptake, and suppressing appetite. To a miner working long shifts or a farmer carrying loads uphill, the effect could mean finishing a day rather than collapsing midway. Coca was also psychological medicine. Offering quintus before planting or travel gave people the sense that they were accompanied, not alone. Anthropologists who studied Andean communities in the 20th century often noted how coca chewing was less about intoxication and more about social bonding. Passing leaves during a conversation was like pouring tea or coffee elsewhere, a gesture of connection, struggle, and survival. Under colonial rule, Spanish colonization could not erase these practices. Priests railed against coca as a tool of idolatry, but even they grudgingly admitted its utility in the mines. Indigenous workers, forced into the mita system of labor drafts, survived only because coca dulled the pain of 12-hour shifts underground. By the 17th century, colonial administrators were distributing coca to miners as a matter of policy. The leaf's dual role, sacred in villages, commodified in mines, became locked into Andean life. Still, rituals endured. At weddings, coca bundles were offered to bless fertility. At funerals, leaves were tucked into the mouths of the dead to sustain them in the afterlife. On planting days, coca was fanned toward the soil before seeds were pressed in. Even as the Spanish crown taxed and profited from coca, it remained at the center of indigenous cosmology. To chew was to survive, but also to honor ancestors and gods. Coca in the 18th and 19th centuries. Even after independence from Spain in the early 1800s, coca's role persisted. Bolivian and Peruvian elites often scorned coca, chewing as a peasant habit, yet they profited from its trade. Merchants transported baskets of dried leaves by mule across the Andes. Mining continued, and miners still needed coca. At the same time, European travelers began to notice the plant with curiosity. In 1702, The explorer Alexander von Humboldt observed coca use in the Andes, noting how it allowed workers to resist hunger and fatigue. Later, other writers remarked on its medicinal qualities, though many dismissed indigenous explanations as superstition. By the mid-19th century, coca had acquired an exotic reputation in Europe. To some, it was evidence of indigenous resilience. To others, a curiosity to be studied and extracted. This curiosity would soon culminate in 1859, when German chemist Albert Niemann isolated a crystalline alkaloid from the leaves. He called it cocaine, the triple identity of coca. By the time Niemann began his experiments, coca already carried 3 intertwined identities: sacred offering, part of rituals that connected humans to earth, sky, and ancestors; endurance tool, sustaining runners, miners, and farmers in some of the harshest environments on earth; medicine, used to treat altitude sickness, stomach pains, and fatigue. For millennia, these roles coexisted. Coca was both ordinary and extraordinary, a pocketful of green leaves that could bless a child, ease a stomach, or carry a runner across a mountain range. What no one in the Andes could foresee was how a European laboratory would take that quiet companion and transform it into something far more powerful and far more dangerous. Part 2. Cocaine comes to Europe. Niemann isolates cocaine. Freud experiments. In the 19th century, science unlocked the secret of coca, and Europe turned a sacred leaf into a fashionable medicine. What followed was both discovery and delusion. In 1859, a young German chemist named Albert Niemann stood at a laboratory bench in Göttingen, Germany. From a pile of dried green leaves imported from South America, he had extracted a clear, crystalline substance. Niemann named it cocaine. He described it clinically: colorless, transparent prism, producing on the tongue a peculiar numbness, followed by a feeling of local anesthesia. What indigenous Andean farmers had known for thousands of years as a mild endurance aid was now, in Niemann's hands, a purified alkaloid, a new object of European science. Picture yourself in that lab in 1859. The air is heavy with the smell of solvents and dried plants. Glass jars are stacked on wooden shelves, labeled with names in Latin. In your hand, you hold a tiny crystal that sparkles faintly under the lamplight. You taste it. Your tongue tingles and grows numb. A door has opened, though no one yet knows where it leads. The process was difficult. Niemann ground coca leaves, treated them with lime and solvents, then evaporated the solution until crystals appeared. His dissertation, published that year, coined the term cocaine for the alkaloid. The discovery placed coca into the larger 19th century wave of alkaloid extractions morphine from opium in 1804, quinine from cinchona bark in 1820, nicotine, caffeine. Each new substance was celebrated as modern science, distilling nature's secrets into tools for medicine. Niemann's early work noted cocaine's unique property. It dulled sensation. This local numbing effect made it stand out among other plant extracts. But Niemann would not live to see its applications. He died young, at 26, of exposure to poisonous gases during laboratory experiments. His discovery, however, would ripple outward across Europe. In the decades after 1859, cocaine intrigued scientists, but remained a rarity. Coca leaves were still difficult to import in quantity, and the process of extraction was laborious. Still, curiosity grew. Doctors experimented with its effects on fatigue, digestion, and breathing. A few papers noted its ability to sharpen focus and ease hunger, mirroring what Andean cocachures had long described. By the 1870s, pharmaceutical firms like Merck in Germany began producing small amounts of cocaine for research. In 1879, the plant physiologist Vasily von Anrep suggested it could be useful as a local anesthetic, though practical applications were still limited. Cocaine hovered on the edges of European medicine, not yet mainstream, but gathering attention. In 1884, a young Austrian doctor named Sigmund Freud picked up the story. Then 28 years old and struggling to establish himself in Vienna's medical world, Freud was fascinated by the reports of cocaine. He ordered samples from Merck and began experimenting on patients, colleagues, and himself. Freud found the drug stimulating. He described bursts of energy, clarity of thought, and feelings of well-being. In April 1884, he began drafting a paper that would make him briefly famous, titled Über Coca, On Coca. It praised the drug in sweeping terms. Cocaine, Freud wrote, could be used to treat indigestion, asthma, fatigue, even morphine addiction. He declared it a magical substance. Freud's enthusiasm was not purely scientific. He also gave cocaine to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, boasting of its energizing effects. He shared it with friends. His notes describe nights of euphoria, confidence, and productivity. Like many later users, Freud was convinced that he had discovered a safe stimulant, a medicine with almost limitless potential. Freud was not alone. Doctors across Europe began prescribing cocaine for a wide array of conditions. It was marketed as a treatment for depression, anxiety, alcoholism, and morphine withdrawal. Patients were given lozenges, tonics, or injections. Pharmacies stocked small vials of cocaine hydrochloride as a pick-me-up for fatigue. By the mid-1880s, cocaine had entered mainstream medicine. One of its most important applications came from ophthalmologist Carl Kohler, a colleague of Freud. In 1884, Kohler demonstrated that a few drops of cocaine solution applied to the eye made it numb, allowing surgeons to operate painlessly. This was revolutionary. Until then, eye surgery had been agonizing. Cocaine's use as the first effective local anesthetic spread rapidly through Europe and the United States. Surgeons hailed it as a breakthrough. Medical journals filled with reports. Cocaine could dull pain in dental work, minor surgery, and throat operations. In the span of a few years, a leaf once chewed in Andean fields was now at the center of modern medicine. The numbers tell the story. In 1884, Merck produced less than half a kilo of cocaine. By 1886, production had surged to over 150 kilos annually. By the 1890s, the figure reached thousands of kilos. Demand from doctors, pharmacists, and researchers skyrocketed. Freud's writings added fuel. He published multiple papers, including case studies where cocaine seemed to help patients withdraw from morphine. What he overlooked, however, was that many of these patients simply traded one addiction for another. By the late 1880s, reports of cocaine abuse and dependence began appearing. Doctors noted paranoia, hallucinations, and physical collapse among patients who used it heavily. Freud himself eventually became embarrassed by his early advocacy, retreating from the subject as his career shifted toward neurology and psychoanalysis. Outside hospitals, cocaine's reputation spread into popular culture. It appeared in patent medicines, energy tonics, and even wines. By the late 19th century, Vin Mariani, a French coca wine containing both alcohol and cocaine, was endorsed by celebrities from Pope Leo XIII to Thomas Edison. In the United States, John Pemberton added coca extract to his new soft drink, Coca-Cola, in 1886. These products belonged to the next wave of cocaine's history, but the foundation was laid in Niemann's lab and Freud's enthusiasm. The arc from 1859 to the 1890s was one of optimism. Cocaine was hailed as science's triumph, a natural product transformed into a modern medicine, a miracle alkaloid with endless promise. Doctors praised it, patients welcomed it, pharmaceutical companies profited from it. Yet beneath the excitement, cracks were forming. Reports of abuse multiplied. Addictions that Freud had hoped cocaine could cure seemed only to deepen. The same properties that made cocaine useful as a numbing agent also made it dangerous as a stimulant. What had begun as a scientific curiosity was on its way to becoming a public health crisis. Coca wine, Coca-Cola, pharmacies, and patent medicines. By the 1870s, cocaine was no longer just a laboratory curiosity. It had begun to spread into the marketplace, bottled, blended, and sold as a cure for nearly everything. Doctors prescribed it, pharmacists stocked it, and companies found ways to lace it into products that blurred the line between medicine and indulgence. One of the most famous was Vin Mariani, a French coca wine introduced in 1863. Its creator, Angelo Mariani, was a Corsican chemist who saw opportunity in coca at a time when Europe was obsessed with exotic plants. Mariani soaked coca leaves in Bordeaux wine, allowing alcohol to extract the cocaine alkaloids. The result was a tonic that combined two stimulants, ethanol and cocaine, in a single drink. Each liter contained the equivalent of 150 to 300 milligrams of cocaine. A single glass produced mild stimulation, lifted fatigue, and gave drinkers a sense of vigor. Mariani marketed it as a cure for melancholy, indigestion, and exhaustion. In an era before energy drinks, Vin Mariani promised both productivity and pleasure. The endorsements were extraordinary. By the 1880s, Pope Leo XIII had not only blessed the drink, but appeared in advertisements holding a bottle. He even awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal for the benefits of coca wine. Writers like Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle praised it. Inventor Thomas Edison claimed it sharpened his focus. Opera singer Sarah Bernhardt swore by it before performances. Mariani filled scrapbooks with hundreds of celebrity endorsements, a 19th century version of influencer marketing. Picture yourself in a Parisian cafe in 1885. A waiter sets down a glass of Vin Mariani. It smells faintly of oak and herbs, like any red wine, but the first sip carries a sharp edge, a burst of warmth followed by a subtle tingling on the tongue. Conversation quickens, fatigue fades, and the whole room feels charged with light. Vin Mariani was a commercial triumph. By the late 1880s, Mariani's company was shipping cases across Europe and into the United States. The tonic was sold in pharmacies, grocers, and even exported to colonial markets. At its peak, Mariani was producing hundreds of thousands of bottles per year. The drink cemented cocaine's reputation as both fashionable and medicinal. In America, the idea quickly inspired imitators. The most famous was Coca-Cola, created in Atlanta, Georgia in 1886. Its inventor, John Pemberton, was a pharmacist and former Confederate soldier wounded in the Civil War. Addicted to morphine for his pain, Pemberton experimented with patent medicines to create alternatives. He developed French wine coca, a local version of Vin Mariani that blended coca leaf extract with Bordeaux wine. When Atlanta passed prohibition laws banning alcohol in 1886, Pemberton reformulated the product. He removed the wine and added sugar, caffeine-rich cola nut, and soda water. The result was a sweet, effervescent drink that still contained coca extract. The name combined both ingredients, coca from the coca leaf and cola from the cola nut. The early versions of Coca-Cola contained an estimated 9 milligrams of cocaine per serving. While not enough to intoxicate heavily, regular consumption delivered a stimulant boost. Sold at soda fountains for 5 cents a glass, Coca-Cola was marketed as a temperance drink, a healthy, non-alcoholic tonic for body and mind. Imagine walking into a drugstore in Atlanta in 1890. The marble soda fountain gleams under gaslight. Clerks in white jackets serve fizzy drinks to a crowd of office clerks, shop girls, and traveling salesmen. You order a Coca-Cola. It is sweet, carbonated, and refreshing. You leave with more energy than when you arrived. By the 1890s, Coca-Cola was spreading rapidly. The company promoted it as a brain tonic and intellectual beverage. Advertisements promised it would relieve headaches, boost stamina, and cure nervous afflictions. In reality, it delivered a cocktail of sugar, caffeine, and cocaine. Patent medicines of the era took this even further. The late 19th century was a golden age of unregulated remedies. Before modern drug laws, almost anything could be sold as a tonic, elixir, or cure. Cocaine appeared in lozenges for sore throats, powders for hay fever, cigarettes for asthma, and syrups for fatigue. It was sold to adults, children, and even infants. One advertisement for Rhino's hay fever and catarrh remedy boasted that each dose contained cocaine. Another, Allen's cocaine tablets, promised relief from headaches and indigestion. Chemists produced cocaine toothpaste, cocaine chewing gum, even cocaine injections for neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis for middle-class exhaustion. Statistics illustrate the boom. By 1900, American pharmaceutical catalogs listed more than 200 cocaine-based products. Coca leaves were imported in bulk, hundreds of tons annually, to meet demand. Pharmaceutical companies like Merck in Germany and Parke-Davis in the United States expanded production. Parke-Davis marketed cocaine as a treatment for morphine addiction, depression, and fatigue, claiming it was a safe substitute. In their advertisements, Parke-Davis declared, "Cocaine can supply the place of food, make the coward brave, the silent eloquent, and render the sufferer insensitive to pain." Doctors prescribed it liberally. Pharmacies sold it over the counter. Middle-class households kept cocaine remedies in the medicine cabinet. Picture yourself as a clerk in a 19th century apothecary. Behind the counter are rows of amber bottles with handwritten labels: quinine, morphine, opium tincture, and now cocaine hydrochloride. Customers arrive complaining of fatigue, hay fever, or melancholy. You hand over a vial of white powder in a paper packet. The transaction feels ordinary. Another remedy in the age of miracles. But even as the market expanded, concerns began to surface. By the late 1890s, reports of dependence and abuse were growing harder to ignore. Newspapers carried stories of cocaine fiends, especially in urban America. Doctors noticed that patients prescribed cocaine often returned for larger and larger doses. Cases of hallucinations, paranoia, and even sudden deaths were documented. In 1895, the medical journal The Lancet warned that cocaine's risks were being overlooked. Some hospitals reported patients arriving in crisis after using patent medicines containing high doses. Cocaine's reputation began to split. Miracle drug on one hand, dangerous intoxicant on the other. Yet regulation lagged behind. In most countries, cocaine remained freely available well into the early 20th century. It took decades before governments began restricting sales. In the meantime, millions of people around the world encountered cocaine not as a criminal substance, but as a respectable medicine or refreshing drink. By the turn of the century, coca and cocaine were woven into global commerce. Vin Mariani remained popular in Europe. Coca-Cola was expanding across the United States. Pharmacies stocked powders, lozenges, and syrups. Cocaine was everywhere, in churches, in parlors, in schools, in hospitals. This widespread presence shaped public perception. Unlike opium, associated with marginalized communities and opium dens, cocaine carried a veneer of sophistication. It was consumed by elites, endorsed by intellectuals, and sold in brightly labeled packages that promised vitality. The cultural message was simple. Cocaine was progress, bottled. But cracks were widening. Doctors, journalists, and even some manufacturers began acknowledging the dangers. Addiction cases mounted. Cocaine's early glamour began to darken. The same society that once celebrated it as a tonic for body and soul would soon grapple with its consequences. By 1900, cocaine had moved from the Andes to the laboratories of Europe, into the cafes of Paris, the soda fountains of Atlanta, and the cabinets of middle-class families. It was sacred leaf, transformed into global commodity. What had been ritual and medicine in the Andes was now industry and advertising in the West. The leaf that once sustained Inca runners was now sustaining empires of commerce, and with each bottle sold, each tonic swallowed, the world grew closer to the age of cocaine addiction and prohibition. The apothecary clerk and the spread of cocaine medicines. It is 1898. You are an apprentice clerk in a bustling apothecary shop in London. The shelves stretch high above your head, lined with amber bottles, brass scales, and handwritten labels. Customers arrive in a steady stream, each with ailments complaints, or simple fatigue. Your task is to measure powders, fold paper packets, and provide remedies. One of the most common requests is for cocaine. It comes in small glass vials of crystalline powder or in tablets pressed into neat circles. Sometimes it is mixed into lozenges for sore throats. Sometimes it is dissolved into a tonic for nervous exhaustion. To you, it is just another medicine, as ordinary as aspirin would be a century later. On the counter sits a brass apothecary scale. Each gram of cocaine hydrochloride is weighed carefully, then slid into a folded paper envelope sealed with string. A label reads, "For medicinal use only. Dose as directed by physician." But customers often return without prescriptions, claiming they know what they need. Few questions are asked. Cocaine is legal, available, and in high demand. Behind you hangs a colorful advertisement for Park Davis, the American pharmaceutical giant. The poster declares, "Cocaine, the wonder drug, safe, reliable, indispensable." Illustrations show smiling patients, energetic workers, and doctors confidently prescribing. The message is clear. Cocaine is not a vice, it is progress. By 1900, Park Davis was one of the largest producers of cocaine in the world. Their factories in Detroit refined coca leaves imported from South America into pure alkaloid. The company claimed to produce hundreds of thousands of doses per year. Merck in Germany did the same, exporting worldwide. Cocaine had become a staple of the pharmaceutical trade. Doctors prescribed it for hay fever, asthma, toothaches, indigestion, and depression. Dentists used it to numb gums before extractions. Surgeons applied it in eye operations. Women were told it would ease menstrual pain. Men were told it would restore sexual vitality. Children were even dosed with cocaine syrups for coughs and colds. Statistics from the era are striking. In the United States, between 1885 and 1900, consumption of coca and cocaine products rose from negligible amounts to tens of tons annually. By some estimates, Americans consumed over 500,000 doses of cocaine-based remedies each month by the turn of the century. In Britain, patent medicines containing cocaine were sold in nearly every pharmacy. Imagine yourself serving a well-dressed gentleman at the counter. He explains that he suffers from hay fever every spring. You hand him a small tin labeled Rhino's Hay Fever and Catarrh Remedy. It contains cocaine hydrochloride in each tablet. He pays and tips his hat, assured he will breathe easier by morning. Next, a young mother arrives with a child coughing from a cold. She purchases a syrup containing cocaine and morphine. The instructions say, 1 teaspoon before bed. To her, it is not reckless. It is science, endorsed by doctors and trusted by families. The apothecary itself is filled with the optimism of the age. Chemistry seems to promise solutions for every human problem. Morphine for pain, chloral hydrate for sleep, cocaine for fatigue and depression. Each plant of empire turned into a product of industry. But in the back of the shop, whispers circulate. Some patients return too often. They ask for larger doses, claiming their medicine is no longer effective. Others seem jittery, paranoid, or unwell. You notice their hands tremble when they reach for the packet. Not all customers are the same when they leave as when they arrived. Medical journals had begun reporting the dangers. In 1887, the first cases of cocaine addiction were described in the United States. By the 1890s, British and American doctors wrote of cocainism, a condition of dependence marked by insomnia, paranoia, and physical decline. Still, demand remained high. Profits silenced doubt. In New York, cocaine was available in corner drugstores for a few cents per dose. It was sold in Harlem, in Manhattan, in small shops across the boroughs. Working-class laborers used it for energy. Wealthier clients used it for nerves. It crossed class lines effortlessly. By 1902, an estimated 200,000 Americans were habitual cocaine users. Some were patients. Some were recreational experimenters. Some were simply workers trying to endure long hours. The lines between medicine and habit blurred. In your apothecary, you hear conflicting stories. One customer insists cocaine saved his business by keeping him awake long hours. Another admits she feels unwell if she stops taking it, yet cannot function without it. A young man confesses that he chews the tablets recreationally, enjoying the rush. You sell the doses anyway. It is not your job to question. Advertising amplified the enthusiasm. Cocaine chewing gum was marketed as a cure for fatigue. Cocaine toothache drops were advertised for children. Tonics promised to restore energy to mind and body. In reality, they delivered brief euphoria followed by dependence. Imagine walking down a London street in 1900. Billboards show Vin Mariani, Coca-Cola, and dozens of patent medicines. A poster promises relief from asthma with cocaine cigarettes. Another advertises cocaine tablets for singers to clear their throats before performance. Cocaine is not hidden in alleys. It is painted on the walls of the city. But the cracks widened. By 1905, newspapers reported sensational stories of cocaine fiends. In the American South, racist stereotypes linked cocaine to black laborers, fueling fear and calls for restriction. In Britain, reports of overdose deaths alarmed the public. Doctors who once prescribed it freely began warning against it. The shift was rapid. What had been sold as medicine was now being framed as menace. Governments responded. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, requiring labels on medicines that contained cocaine. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act restricted sales of cocaine and opiates. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act in 1916 restricted cocaine during World War I, fearing it undermined military discipline. By then, the golden age of cocaine pharmacies was over. The apothecary clerk no longer weighed white powder on brass scales for everyday customers. Cocaine retreated from the counters into the shadows. What had been a common household remedy became a controlled substance. Still, the memory lingered. For decades, Coca-Cola quietly reduced and then eliminated cocaine from its formula. Vin Mariani faded into history. Pharmacies moved on to aspirin, barbiturates, and synthetic drugs. But cocaine remained, no longer in glass vials, but in the hands of traffickers and smugglers. Looking back, the story of the apothecary clerk is astonishing. For a brief window in the late 19th century, cocaine was as ordinary as cough syrup. It was legal, celebrated, and trusted. Patients believed it would heal them. Doctors believed it was safe. Companies believed it was profit. The truth was more complicated. Cocaine numbed pain and cleared airways, but it also rewired minds. It energized workers, but left them dependent. It soothed throats, but frayed nerves. The contradictions could not be hidden forever. Your final task of the evening is to lock the shelves, sweep the floor, and record the day's sales. The ledger shows dozens of packets, lozenges, and syrups sold. Numbers without stories. But each sale represents a life altered by a crystal once extracted in a German laboratory. Cocaine's European chapter had moved from science to medicine, from medicine to mass market, and from mass market to controversy. The apothecary clerk's quiet work was part of a global shift. What began as an ancient Andean leaf had become an international commodity. And though governments tried to push it back into the shadows, cocaine's story was far from finished. Part 3: Industry, Crime and Cultures, Small Farmers, Coca Fields, Jungle Chemistry. By the late 20th century, coca had left the mountains for the jungle labs, the cartel boardrooms, and the smuggling routes of a global black market. Cocaine was no longer medicine, it was empire. It is the late 1970s, and the world has changed for coca farmers. The leaf that once sold for a few coins in village markets now fuels an international industry worth billions. The Andes remain poor, but demand from the United States and Europe is soaring. Fields expand, buyers arrive in greater numbers, and the line between subsistence and crime grows thin. Picture yourself as a farmer in the upper Huallaga Valley of Peru. You rise before dawn, stepping onto damp soil that smells of earth and smoke. Your coca bushes are taller than your waist, green and heavy with leaves. This is no longer just a family plot for chewing and tea. It is hectares under cultivation, rows upon rows of shrubs destined for a market far beyond the mountains. In 1978, Peru was producing more than 60,000 hectares of coca. By the early 1980s, that number doubled, making the country the largest coca producer in the world. UN surveys estimated that over 90% of Peruvian coca harvests were diverted into cocaine production. The legal market, coca tea, chewing, traditional medicine, was a sliver of the total. Farmers could not ignore the math. A kilo of dried coca leaves sold legally for $3 to $5. Traffickers paid $40 to $60 per kilo. In poor valleys where annual incomes rarely exceeded $500 per household, the choice was stark. A hectare of coca could yield 1,500 to 2,000 kilos of leaves annually. That translated into $2,000 legally or $60,000 on the black market. For peasants, traffickers' money was survival. The harvest itself remained labor-intensive. Men, women, and children spent long days picking leaves by hand, filling sacks that weighed 15 to 30 kilos fresh. The work was repetitive, backs bent, fingers stained green. Each family delivered their sacks to drying yards where leaves were spread on mats under the sun. Within days, the fresh weight shrank by 2/3. The dried leaves, lighter and more concentrated, were stacked in burlap sacks, ready for transport. But unlike in the past, the sacks rarely went to legal markets. They went instead to clandestine buyers, men who arrived in trucks or on mule trains, paying cash on the spot. Sometimes the buyers were locals, other times they were emissaries from cartels in Colombia. Everyone knew the path: coca leaves into coca paste, paste into base, base into refined cocaine hydrochloride. Jungle chemistry became the new reality. Processing labs sprang up in remote valleys and forest clearings. They were crude but effective. Oil drums served as mixing vats. Wooden paddles stirred the slurries. Farmers, desperate for income, often doubled as lab workers. The process was simple but toxic. Dried coca leaves were dumped into barrels and soaked with gasoline or kerosene. Workers stomped or stirred until the alkaloids dissolved. Acids like sulfuric were added, then lime or cement to precipitate paste. The result was a beige, sticky substance called coca paste. Each 100 kilos of dried leaves produced roughly 2.5 kilos of paste. The paste was then sold again, either to mid-level processors or directly to Colombian traffickers. In Colombia, paste would be further refined into cocaine hydrochloride using ether acetone, ammonia, and hydrochloric acid. 1 kilo of finished cocaine required about 350 kilos of dried leaves. By the 1980s, a kilo of cocaine sold wholesale in Miami for $50,000 to $70,000 US. At street level, it could generate profits of over $100,000. Farmers saw almost none of this wealth. At most, they earned a fraction, a few $100s per harvest cycle. But compared to legal crops like corn or coffee, coca was irresistible. Coffee required years to mature. Corn brought pennies. Coca produced harvests 4 times a year, steady and reliable. In the villages, this shift transformed daily life. Cash began circulating in communities that had rarely seen it before. Some families bought radios, motorcycles, even tin roofs. Others sent children to school for the first time. But prosperity was fragile. With traffickers came violence, extortion, and the attention of both guerrillas and government soldiers. In Peru, the Shining Path insurgency spread through coca regions in the 1980s. The guerrillas taxed coca farmers, demanding loyalty and levies on the harvest. Traffickers paid the rebels for protection. The army arrived to crush both. Farmers were caught in the middle, accused of collaboration, no matter whom they sold to. The valleys became battlegrounds. Coca fields burned, villages raided. Imagine yourself standing in a jungle clearing at midnight. A single kerosene lamp lights a barrel half filled with leaves. Your hands sting from gasoline. Your lungs burn from chemical vapors. You stir anyway, because the paste in the barrel means food for your children. Around you, men with rifles stand guard, listening for helicopters. The risks escalated with each link in the chain. Transporters carried sacks of paste by mule or truck through mountain passes, bribing police or hiding from patrols. Pilots flew small planes from clandestine airstrips, ferrying loads to Colombia. Each journey meant arrests, seizures, or death. But each journey also meant cash. The scale of the industry was staggering. By 1985, Peru's coca production alone could supply 200 to 250 tons of cocaine annually. Colombia's cartels, Medellin and Cali, depended on Peruvian leaves. Together, the Andean nations produced nearly 100% of global supply. The United States became the largest consumer, with demand exploding in cities from Miami to Los Angeles. Farmers knew little of this distant market. They knew only that traffickers kept returning, always with money. They chewed coca during the day to fight fatigue. They whispered about soldiers and guerrillas at night. They worked fields that tied them to global currents of crime they did not control. Statistics told the bigger story. In 1980, the USDEA estimated that coca farming employed 200,000 to 300,000 households across Peru and Bolivia. By the end of the decade, the number had doubled. Entire valleys shifted from subsistence crops to coca monocultures. When eradication campaigns destroyed fields, hunger followed. When traffickers offered protection, farmers had little choice but to accept. The culture of coca itself also shifted. Once a sacred companion for Andean laborers, it became a contested symbol. Some defended it as tradition. Others condemned it as the root of cocaine's violence. Farmers themselves occupied the uneasy middle, proud of their leaf, fearful of its uses, dependent on its income. In a Hualaga village, a farmer might tell you plainly, "We grow coca because nothing else keeps us alive." His words echo across valleys, repeated in Quechua, Aymara, and Spanish. It is not ideology but arithmetic. Coca means survival in a world that left few alternatives. As night falls, the jungle hums with insects and distant dogs. Somewhere, paste is drying on a plastic sheet. Somewhere, a child coughs from chemical fumes. Somewhere, a trafficker counts stacks of bills. The leaf has carried everyone here, farmers, guerrillas, smugglers, soldiers, into the same tangled economy. The small farmer remains the foundation of it all. His harvest may be modest, his pay may be meager. But without his labor, the empires of crime above him could not exist. The coca fields of Peru and Bolivia are the first link in a chain that stretches to Miami nightclubs, New York penthouses, and European boulevards. The farmer bends again to his bushes, filling another sack. He is not thinking of cartels or cocaine. He is thinking of tomorrow's meal, of a child's shoes, of debts to a neighbor. But the leaves in his hands are already destined for a journey that will change the world. Transition to organized crime, cartels, and global smuggling. It is the early 1980s. The coca leaves drying on reed mats in Andean valleys no longer end their journey in village markets. They are moving north, transformed first into paste, then into crystalline white powder. That powder will define a decade. Colombian traffickers dominate this new stage. What began as small-scale smuggling in the 1970s has become a global system. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, and Carlos Leyra, grows into a multinational empire. Their rivals in Cali, headed by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, refine cocaine with equal ambition. Imagine yourself as a low-level smuggler in 1981. You sit in a jungle clearing near Puerto Asís, Colombia. A small plane lands on a dirt strip, its cargo compartment waiting. You help load plastic-wrapped bundles of cocaine base, each worth thousands of dollars. The pilot takes off toward the Caribbean, where the drugs will be moved again. Your pay is a handful of bills, more than you would make in months as a farmer. But above you, others count millions. The numbers tell the scale. By 1982, the DEA estimated Colombia exported 50 to 70 tons of cocaine annually. By 1985, that figure exceeded 150 tons per year. By 1989, U.S. authorities claimed over 400 tons of cocaine entered global markets annually. Wholesale, the trade was worth tens of billions of dollars. The supply chain was ruthless but efficient. Leaves harvested in Peru and Bolivia were converted to paste. Paste was smuggled into Colombia by mule, truck, and plane. Labs in Colombia refined the paste into cocaine hydrochloride, ready for export. Each kilo cost $1,000 to $1,500 to produce in the Andes. In Miami, that same kilo sold wholesale for $50,000 to $70,000 US. On the street, broken down into grams, it fetched over 100,000 US. The profits created power. Escobar became one of the richest men in the world, with a net worth estimated at 25 to 30 billion US. The Medellin cartel controlled up to 80% of global supply at its peak. They bought planes, submarines, politicians, judges, and entire communities. Money washed into banks, real estate, and offshore accounts. Cocaine was no longer a drug, it was an economy. Distribution relied on creativity. Cartels used fishing boats, cargo containers, luxury yachts, and small aircraft. In the Caribbean, islands like the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos became waypoints. In Central America, traffickers bribed officials to allow overland shipments north. By the mid-1980s, Mexico emerged as a critical transit corridor, with cartels paying Mexican traffickers a percentage of each load. The United States became the epicenter of demand. In 1982, an estimated 4.8 million Americans had tried cocaine. By 1985, over 10 million reported past year use. Cocaine was glamorized as the champagne of drugs. It appeared in films, in nightclubs, in the hands of Wall Street traders. Lines of powder were sniffed from glass tables, credit cards, and bathroom counters. But the costs were hidden. Emergency room visits for cocaine-related problems skyrocketed. Addiction treatment centers reported waves of new patients. Crack cocaine, a cheaper smokable form, devastated inner cities. By 1986, crack epidemics tore through New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. Back in Colombia, violence escalated. Escobar declared war on the state when extradition treaties threatened his empire. Bombings, assassinations, and massacres became routine. Judges, journalists, and politicians were murdered. In 1989, A bomb destroyed Avianca Flight 203, killing 107 people. Escobar's message was clear. No one was untouchable. Imagine yourself as a police officer in Medellin during these years. You patrol neighborhoods where children sell cocaine on street corners. You see mansions rise overnight, surrounded by poverty. You know informants disappear. You know colleagues are bribed or killed if they refuse. Every raid feels like walking into a death trap. The Cali cartel offered a contrast. They preferred bribes over bombs, corruption over open war. They infiltrated politics, business, and law enforcement quietly. By the early 1990s, Cali supplied an estimated 80% of US cocaine. They invested profits in legitimate businesses, banks, pharmacies, and supermarkets. Their slogan might as well have been plata o plomo, in whispers, not gunfire. The global system hardened. Europe became a major consumer market, with cocaine entering through Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. By 1990, Western Europe consumed 40 to 50 tons annually. Prices were lower than in the US, but demand was steady. Cocaine became part of the nightlife from London to Milan. The human toll was immense. Farmers remained trapped at the bottom, paid pennies while risking everything. Mules carried pellets of cocaine in their stomachs, many dying when the capsules burst. Pilots died in crashes on jungle strips. Police and soldiers faced ambushes. Civilians endured bombings and massacres. Still, the trade grew. By 1992, global cocaine production exceeded 500 tons per year. The United Nations estimated the trade generated $100 to $150 billion annually worldwide. It rivaled the GDP of entire nations, and it was built on the backs of small farmers, chemists in jungle labs, smugglers, and cartel lords. The cocaine boom reshaped entire societies. In Colombia, cartels destabilized democracy itself. In the United States, cocaine reshaped policing, prisons, and politics. In Europe, it became woven into culture and nightlife. Everywhere, it drew lines between rich users and poor producers. Imagine standing in a Miami nightclub in 1986. The music is loud, the lights strobe. On a mirrored table, white powder is chopped into neat lines. Businessmen, celebrities, and models bend forward, laughing. No one speaks of the farmers, the mules, or the dead in Medellin. The powder feels clean here, a symbol of luxury. But its path is soaked in gasoline, blood, and fire. By the late 1980s, governments intensified crackdowns. The DEA expanded operations in Latin America. The US launched interdiction programs in the Caribbean and Central America. Crop eradication campaigns sprayed herbicides over coca fields, destroying livelihoods and fueling resentment. Yet seizures only captured a fraction of shipments. For every kilo seized, several slipped through. The cartels adapted. When Caribbean routes tightened, they shifted to Mexico. When planes were tracked, they used submarines and speedboats. When governments attacked leaders, lieutenants replaced them. The system flexed, bent, and endured. For the small farmer, nothing changed. The field still demanded harvests. The buyers still came with cash. The risks grew, but so did the need. The leaf remained the starting point of an empire of crime. The 1980s ended with a grim balance. Cocaine was no longer a novelty. It was a fixture of global markets, a driver of violence, a weapon of cartels. The Medellin cartel fell in the early 1990s with Escobar's death. But the system he embodied did not die. It spread, fractured, and multiplied. The transition from sacred leaf to global commodity was complete. What had begun in mountain terraces now circled the globe in jets, boats, and suitcases. Cocaine was no longer the product of tradition or science. It was the product of organized crime, money laundering, and violence on a scale the world had never seen. The small smuggler, the police officer, the nightclub patron, all were part of the same chain, and the chain was only growing stronger. Jungle lab worker and border mule. POV. Picture yourself deep in the Amazon basin, far from paved roads or electricity. The year is 1987. Your job is not in the coca fields, but in the hidden jungle labs that turn leaves into paste and paste into cocaine. The air is heavy with gasoline and kerosene. Plastic drums line a clearing hacked out of the forest. Men work shirtless in the heat, stirring barrels with wooden paddles. The ground is slick with chemicals. The rivers downstream carry a rainbow sheen. Each barrel holds shredded coca leaves soaked in fuel. Stirring forces the alkaloids out. Acids and lime are added, cement powder too. The mixture curdles into a beige paste. This is the first step, called pasta básica de cocaína. 100 kilos of dried leaves yield 2.5 kilos of paste. Paste sells for $800 to $1,200 per kilo locally. Cartels pay more because they know what comes next. The paste is refined into cocaine hydrochloride, worth $50,000 to $70,000 per kilo in Miami. Workers earn almost nothing. A day in the lab may pay $5 to $10. But in villages where annual incomes rarely break $500, even that wage matters. Many are young men, some are children, drawn in by traffickers' promises. The dangers are constant. Gasoline burns skin, acid eats through clothes, Explosions are common. Inhaling fumes scars lungs permanently. But poverty leaves no safer options. Imagine yourself crouched over a barrel, the sting of sulfuric acid in your nose. Your hands are raw. You stir anyway, because stopping means no pay. At night, you sleep in a hammock strung between trees, with rifles propped against the camp wall. The labs are temporary. They move constantly to evade detection. When soldiers raid, equipment is abandoned and workers scatter into the forest. New labs are built days later. The cycle continues endlessly. From the jungle, paste travels north. This is where mules enter the story. A mule is a human courier who smuggles cocaine across borders. Some carry hidden packets in luggage, others swallow capsules, each the size of a fingertip, coated in plastic. Each mule swallows 50 to 100 capsules, carrying half a kilo to a kilo inside their body. If a capsule bursts, the courier dies in minutes. Recruiters know this. They tell couriers to pray, to drink milk, to walk upright through customs. They pay $3,000 to $5,000 per trip, a fortune for someone poor. Imagine boarding a plane from Bogota to Madrid in 1989. Your stomach is tight with fear and with capsules. You sip water carefully, terrified of breaking one. At the airport, your palms sweat as drug dogs circle. You smile at immigration, heart hammering. If you make it, you live. If you don't, your body becomes contraband and coffin at the same time. Others hide cocaine in luggage. Suitcases are double-lined, stuffed with powder. Sometimes cocaine is molded into statues, soaked into fabrics, or disguised as food. Customs officers search randomly, but thousands slip through. Every seizure represents a loss, but also proof of scale. By the late 1980s, U.S. Customs reported seizing tens of tons of cocaine annually. Yet estimates suggested this was only 10 to 15% of total flow. For every mule caught, 9 succeeded. Airports from Miami to Madrid to Mexico City became invisible battlefields. For traffickers, mules were expendable. If one was arrested, another waited. If one died, recruiters found replacements in slums, villages, or among desperate migrants. The human cost was simply part of the calculation. Meanwhile, cartel scientists improved refinement techniques. Ether, acetone, hydrochloric acid, and ammonia turned paste into sparkling crystals. Labs grew more professional, with ventilation, filtration, and armed guards. In some places, entire ranches became cocaine factories. The scale was staggering. A single jungle complex might produce 200 kilos of cocaine per week. That shipment alone was worth 10 to 14 million US dollars wholesale in the US. Multiply that by dozens of labs and billions flowed through the cartel's hands each year. Workers at the bottom saw none of it. Their pay was small, their lives expendable, but they bore the risks: chemical poisoning, arrests, violence. Many did not live long in the trade. Imagine a customs officer in Miami in 1988. You stand by a conveyor belt as luggage slides past. You look for nervous glances, bulging seams, false bottoms. Every bag could hold fortune or death. Every passenger could be a mule. You seize one suitcase, slice it open, and watch white powder spill out, but dozens more pass uninspected. By the late 1980s, traffickers diversified routes. Cocaine flew by private jet, floated in fishing boats, rode in trucks through Mexico. It entered the US through Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona. Europe saw cocaine arrive in shipping containers, mail parcels, and human couriers. The global machine was too big to stop. Interdictions slowed it. Eradication burned fields. Arrests removed players. But demand never fell. For every worker lost, another stepped in. For every mule arrested, another swallowed capsules. The jungle lab worker and the border mule lived different lives. One stirred barrels in toxic heat. The other risked bursting intestines on a transatlantic flight. But both were cogs in the same machine. Both were poor, both expendable, both necessary for cocaine to reach its markets. The profits at the top depended on their sacrifice. A kilo of cocaine might be worth $1,200 at the lab. By the time it reached New York, it could generate $100,000 on the street. That value chain rested on the cheapest labor imaginable. Bodies became vessels, lungs became filters, rivers became drains for poison. Cartel bosses built mansions and bought soccer teams. Farmers bent backs in coca fields. Workers gagged on fumes. Mules risked lives in airports. The pyramid was clear, vast wealth above, fragile lives below. By 1990, the cocaine economy employed hundreds of thousands across Latin America. The World Bank noted that coca income often surpassed legal agriculture in entire regions. But it was survival, not wealth, for those at the base. The leaf had traveled far from its Andean origins. It was once sacred, then scientific, then industrial. Now, it was a global product, moved by human bodies and chemical fire. The mule on the airplane and the worker in the jungle shared the same fate. They carried the weight of an empire, but they owned none of it. And as long as demand soared in the cities of the north, the supply chain kept moving. From field to barrel, from capsule to customs hall, cocaine flowed like a river, fed by countless small streams. The world saw glamour at the top, white lines, fast cars, nightclubs. But at the bottom, the story was gasoline burns, swallowed capsules, and desperate choices. That was the real machinery of the cocaine trade. Part 4. Cocaine in the Modern Era, 1970s to 80s. Explosion. Miami Vice, Escobar, glamour versus violence. From Miami nightclubs to border checkpoints, cocaine became a defining drug of the modern world. Glamorous, violent, unstoppable. Its journey now reaches the present. The 1970s planted the seeds of a global cocaine boom. The 1980s turned those seeds into a wildfire. In 1975, Colombian traffickers realized that marijuana shipments were bulky, smelly, and easy to detect. Cocaine, in contrast, was compact, powerful, and far more profitable. A kilo of marijuana might fetch $20,000 in the US. A kilo of cocaine, broken into grams, could generate more than $100,000. The math was irresistible. Cartels scaled up rapidly. By the late 1970s, cocaine exports from Colombia reached 20 to 40 tons per year. By 1985, that figure had skyrocketed to 150 tons annually. By 1989, US authorities estimated more than 400 tons of cocaine were flooding global markets each year. Miami became the main gateway. Colombian cartels used speedboats and planes to land shipments along the Florida coast. Cocaine poured into the city at such a pace that journalists called it the cocaine capital of the world. Picture Miami in 1981. Pastel suits, neon lights, nightclubs that never closed. Lines of cocaine drawn on glass tables in private lounges. Dealers, bankers, and celebrities mingling in the same crowded room. The air thick with perfume, sweat, and powder. On the streets, money reshaped the city. Entire banks were flooded with cartel cash. In 1980, the Federal Reserve reported $5 billion in unaccounted cash deposits in Miami banks. Drug money bought mansions, yachts, and sports cars. Neighborhoods once modest became playgrounds of excess. But violence was the other side of glamour. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, unleashed a reign of terror to protect its empire. In Miami, Colombian hitmen fought bloody turf wars with machine guns in broad daylight. The 1980 Dadeland Mall massacre, where gunmen opened fire in a crowded shopping center, shocked the US into realizing how far cartel wars had spread. By 1981, Miami's murder rate was the highest in the nation. Nearly half were linked to the drug trade. DEA and police reports described assassinations on highways, bodies dumped in canals, and entire neighborhoods living in fear. Meanwhile, Escobar built his legend. Born in Rio Negro, Colombia, he rose from car theft to become one of the richest men alive. By the mid-1980s, his fortune was estimated at 25 to 30 billion US dollars. He bought soccer teams, estates, private zoos, and political influence. He was called both El Patron and Robin Hood, depending on who was speaking. Imagine standing outside Escobar's Hacienda Napoli. Exotic animals roam the grounds. Helicopters land with cash and weapons. Villages nearby receive gifts, schools, housing, money for food. Escobar is feared and adored at the same time, but his empire was built on fear. When the Colombian government agreed to extradite traffickers to the US, Escobar responded with war. Bombs exploded in Bogotá. Politicians, judges, and journalists were assassinated. In 1989, Avianca Flight 203 was blown up, killing all 107 on board. That same year, a truck bomb destroyed the DAS intelligence headquarters, killing 63 more. Escobar's message was clear: resist him and die. The cocaine boom spread beyond Miami. New York became a hub of demand, with Wall Street traders snorting lines in office bathrooms. Los Angeles saw cocaine glamorized in Hollywood parties. By 1985, 10.4 million Americans reported past year use of cocaine. It was the drug of choice for the wealthy, the ambitious, and the reckless. But crack cocaine changed the picture. Developed in the early 1980s, crack was cheap, smokable, and addictive. It turned cocaine from a luxury into a street epidemic. By 1986, crack use had devastated neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Addiction soared. So did arrests. In 1986, the US passed harsh sentencing laws. Possession of 5 grams of crack carried the same penalty as 500 grams of powder cocaine. The racial disparity was stark. Crack hit black communities hardest, and prisons filled disproportionately with young men of color. The war on cocaine reshaped US policy. The DEA expanded operations across Latin America. Eradication campaigns sprayed herbicides on coca fields in Peru and Bolivia. Interdiction efforts targeted Caribbean routes, forcing traffickers to adapt. Cartels shifted to Mexico. They struck deals with Mexican traffickers who took payment in cocaine loads instead of cash. This laid the foundation for the rise of Mexican cartels in the 1990s. Meanwhile, Europe's demand grew. By 1990, Western Europe consumed 40 to 50 tons of cocaine annually. Spain and the Netherlands became key entry points. Cocaine filtered into nightclubs in London, Paris, Milan, and Madrid. What began as an American boom became a global market. The contradictions were glaring. In Miami nightclubs, cocaine was seen as a glamorous accessory. In inner cities, crack was seen as a plague. In Colombia, it was blood and fire. At every stage, the same white powder meant wealth for some and ruin for others. Imagine yourself in Miami in 1986. You walk past pastel-colored hotels where Ferraris idle outside. Inside, men with gold chains laugh over champagne and lines of powder. On the next block, a drive-by leaves 2 bodies in the street. This was the dual reality of the cocaine era. Glamour and violence, inseparable. By the end of the 1980s, cocaine had become more than a drug. It was a global industry worth $100 billion annually. It transformed economies, destroyed communities, and toppled lives. It produced billionaires, corpses, and legends. The 1970s and 1980s were cocaine's age of fire. The powder ran through nightclubs, offices, jungles, and battlefields. It reshaped Miami, Colombia, and the wider world. It was a story of glamour built on violence, wealth built on ruin, and the world was only beginning to understand how deep the damage ran. Crackdowns, DEA ops, shifting trafficking routes. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked the high point of the war on cocaine. Governments from Washington to Bogota declared all-out campaigns. Billions of dollars were poured into eradication, interdiction, and enforcement. In 1989, US President George H.W. Bush launched the National Drug Control Strategy, pledging $7.9 billion for anti-drug efforts. More than half went to law enforcement and interdiction rather than treatment. The message was clear: fight cocaine at its source and stop it at the border. Helicopters sprayed herbicides over coca fields in Peru and Bolivia. Entire valleys turned brown as glyphosate and paraquat killed plants indiscriminately. Farmers protested, but their voices were drowned out by policy goals. Many simply replanted deeper in the jungle, beyond the reach of aircraft. Picture yourself as a coca farmer in the upper Huallaga Valley of Peru in 1990. You watch from the hillside as planes buzz low, misting chemicals over your fields. The leaves wither within days. Your family's only cash crop is gone. Yet within weeks, seedlings are in the ground again. There is no alternative. The DEA expanded its footprint in Latin America. Joint task forces with local militaries raided jungle labs. In Colombia, US advisors trained police and soldiers to hunt traffickers. Funding flowed under Plan Colombia and earlier bilateral agreements. The Medellin cartel faced its reckoning. Escobar, once untouchable, became the target of Los Pepes, a vigilante group backed quietly by rivals and sometimes by state forces. His empire crumbled under a relentless assault. In December 1993, Escobar was cornered on a rooftop in Medellin. and killed in a shootout. His death was celebrated worldwide, but the cocaine trade did not collapse. Instead, it shifted. The Cali cartel rose to dominance in the 1990s. Unlike Escobar, the Cali bosses operated quietly. They avoided flamboyance, preferring bribes to bombs. At their peak, they controlled 80% of the world's cocaine trade, moving 500 tons annually. Imagine a port city like Buenaventura, Colombia, in 1994. Shipping containers line the docks. Inside one, 2,000 kilos of cocaine are hidden among coffee bags. Dock workers turn a blind eye, paid to let it pass. The ship sails to Rotterdam, where the cargo will be unpacked under Europe's foggy skies. Interdiction efforts at sea expanded. The US Coast Guard deployed cutters and radar planes across the Caribbean. By the mid-1990s, 30 to 40% of seizures occurred at sea. Yet traffickers adapted, building semi-submersibles, speedboats, and false hulls to move shipments north. When pressure in the Caribbean increased, routes shifted west. By the late 1990s, most cocaine moved through Mexico. Colombian cartels supplied the product, while Mexican groups handled logistics. In exchange, Mexicans began taking payment in cocaine rather than cash. This decision laid the foundation for the rise of the Sinaloa, Juarez, and Gulf cartels. For US authorities, cocaine was a moving target. Every crackdown closed one door but opened another. Every ton seized meant several more got through. Estimates in the 1990s suggested that only 10 to 15% of global cocaine shipments were intercepted. The rest fueled a market worth tens of billions annually. In cities, enforcement hit hardest on the street level. Mandatory minimums filled prisons. By 1995, more than 60% of federal inmates in the US were serving drug sentences. Crack possession carried far harsher penalties than powder cocaine. The racial disparity was undeniable. Black Americans made up the majority of crack convictions, despite representing a minority of users nationwide. Picture a street corner in New York in 1992. Police cars cruise slowly past. Officers jump out, frisk young men, and make arrests over tiny vials of crack. Families watch from apartment windows, knowing some sons will not return for years. The war on cocaine at home meant broken households and overcrowded prisons. Meanwhile, traffickers innovated constantly. Cocaine was pressed into ceramic tiles, melted into plastic, soaked into clothing. Customs officers in Miami, Los Angeles, and Madrid X-rayed suitcases daily, but smugglers stayed ahead. For every clever method caught, another was invented. Demand remained steady. In 1995, the UN estimated that 14 million people worldwide used cocaine annually. The US remained the largest consumer, but Europe's appetite grew rapidly. By the late 1990s, Europe accounted for 20 to 25% of global consumption. The DEA pushed interdiction abroad, but cocaine production spread geographically. When eradication hit Colombia, cultivation expanded in Peru and Bolivia. When Peru was targeted, fields spread back into Colombia. It was a balloon effect. Squeeze one side and the other swelled. In rural Colombia, coca became tied to insurgency. The FARC guerrillas taxed coca growers, ran labs, and used profits to fund war against the state. Paramilitary groups did the same, building their own narco armies. By the late 1990s, Colombia's conflict was fueled heavily by cocaine money. Imagine walking through a coca field in southern Colombia in 1998. Children pick leaves, while armed men stand guard at the edge of the terraces. The harvest is weighed, taxed, and loaded onto mules. The money goes to buy rifles, boots, and radios for fighters in the jungle. Coca has become currency for war. Back in consumer countries, culture reflected the drug's staying power. Cocaine appeared in films, music, and tabloids. Athletes, actors, and politicians were caught in scandals. The drug was both vilified and glamorized, punished harshly, and yet still consumed in elite circles. By the year 2000, global cocaine revenues were estimated at $80 to $100 billion annually. The war on drugs had claimed lives, jailed millions, and shifted battle lines, but the flow of powder never stopped. The crackdowns changed the map, but not the demand. The DEA struck jungles, cartels struck back with bribes and bullets, and the trade adapted. For every field destroyed, another was planted. For every trafficker killed, another emerged. The 1990s proved a truth that still resonates. Cocaine was not just a drug, it was a system, a global machine powered by poverty, demand, and profit. Governments fought it with helicopters and prisons. Cartels fought back with cash and violence. And in the middle, ordinary lives were broken or consumed. The age of Escobar ended in blood. The age of Cali ended in quiet arrests. But cocaine itself survived every crackdown. And as the millennium approached, the trade was shifting again. This time into new routes, new players, and new forms of violence. Customs Officer POV, immersive, closing reflection. It is 2006, and you stand in the fluorescent-lit customs hall of Miami International Airport. The baggage carousel hums. Dozens of tired travelers shuffle forward, gripping passports and duty-free bags. Your eyes are not on their faces. Your eyes are on their luggage. Every suitcase could be a story. Every false compartment could be a career-defining bust, or it could be nothing but dirty laundry. You are a customs officer, part detective, part psychologist, part soldier in a global war. Your job is to find the invisible. Cocaine moves through airports every day, packed into hidden linings of suitcases, pressed into plastic pellets and swallowed by couriers, melted into candle wax, shampoo, or even sculptures. You have seen it all. The numbers are staggering. By the mid-2000s, an estimated 600 tons of cocaine were produced annually worldwide. The United States remained the single largest consumer, with 2.4 million regular users. Europe consumed another 4 million users worth, making Spain, the UK, and Italy hotspots. And every kilo had to cross a border. The pressure is immense. Interdiction rates hover around 10 to 15% of total traffic. That means for every bag you catch, 9 slip through. For every courier stopped, another swallows pellets and boards a plane tomorrow. Picture yourself watching a young man approach the checkpoint. He sweats, though the air is cool. His passport trembles in his hand. Your instincts sharpen. You direct him to secondary screening. Minutes later, an X-ray reveals more than 70 pellets in his stomach. A human body turned into a vessel of risk. This is the front line of cocaine's modern history. Not the lush coca fields of the Andes, not the jungle labs or cartel mansions, but the sterile corridors of airports and border crossings. Here, the global trade shrinks into moments of suspicion, search, and discovery. The methods evolve constantly. In 2008, Spanish authorities seized 500 kilos of cocaine hidden inside frozen sharks. In 2010, Dutch customs officers found bricks concealed in pineapples. You once watched a colleague cut open a suitcase wheel, only to find white powder spilling like flour onto the floor. Every seizure is a victory, but each victory feels small against the scale of the trade. By the 2010s, Mexican cartels dominated trafficking routes. The Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas fought brutal wars over smuggling corridors into the U.S. Entire regions of northern Mexico became battlefields. Tens of thousands died in cartel-related violence. The cocaine kept moving north. You think back to the leaf in the Andes. A farmer plucking leaves at dawn, paid just enough to survive. That same leaf, crushed into paste, carried on mules, flown by traffickers, cut and pressed, hidden and smuggled, is now here, in a bag rolling past your inspection desk. The chain is unbroken, and the stakes are everywhere. On Wall Street, where cocaine fuels long nights of trading. In nightclubs of London and Madrid, where it becomes a weekend ritual. In rural Mexico, where teenagers are armed to guard convoys. In villages of Peru and Bolivia, where farmers face a choice between hunger and the black market. You know the statistics. the global cocaine trade is worth $100 to $120 billion annually. Only a fraction is ever seized. Only a fraction of traffickers are ever caught. The system is too large, too adaptable, too profitable. Still, you search. Still, you watch faces, scan bags, trust instincts. Each interception feels like a drop in the ocean. But without those drops, the ocean would be worse. Imagine the scene from above. The Andes, where coca is picked. The jungles, where it is cooked into paste. The labs, where it is crystallized. The ports, where it is hidden. The plains, where it is smuggled. The clubs, where it is consumed. And you, in an airport, standing between one suitcase and the next. History has carried coca from sacred offering to global obsession. It has been worshipped by farmers, taxed by conquerors, praised by doctors, consumed by celebrities, and fought over by armies. It has built empires of gold and empires of blood. It has crossed mountains, oceans, borders, and decades. And here, under fluorescent lights, it rests inside a bag, waiting for your hand. Cocaine is not just a drug. It is a mirror of the world, poverty and wealth, ritual and excess, survival and destruction. Its story is not finished. It continues in every leaf picked, every line drawn, every seizure logged. You take a breath. Another passenger approaches. Another bag rolls forward. The story goes on.